Bronte and the book they call Depraved. Boyce shows how critics receive the novel when she says critics called the novel savage, wicked, and animal-like. Graham's Ladies magazine said, how a human being could have attempted such a book without committing suicide is a mystery. These critics are speaking of Emily Bronte's tragic Gothic fiction novel, Wuthering Heights. It was published on November 24th, 1847. Critics received it so poorly because of the abuse, violence, and desire that occurs on every page, making most of the characters seem less than human. In this conference paper, I argue that the binary of victim and abuser drives the cyclical structure of abuse over 2.5 generations. The larger project argues that the binary of abuser and victim is what produces this dynamic, that the relationship of Kathy and Hareton resists the binary and ends the dynamic, and that Wittig's social contract characterizes it. The part I am presenting today demonstrates how hurt people, how Wittig's theory of the social contract shows how people become abusive when they are lawful, not when they are unlawful, and how that can carry over generations. The story follows Heathcliff on the isolated Yorkshire moors when he enters the lives of the Earnshaw and Linton families. Heathcliff, full of resentment because of Catherine's marriage to Edgar and years of abuse by Hindley, enacts plans for revenge that extend into the next generation. By suggesting the binary itself produces the cycle, the relationship that resists the binary ends the cycle, and Wittig's social contract forces characters to behave according to gender norms, I build on a history of scholarship that tends to suggest desire, society's expectations, and the patriarchal abuse of power cause the abuse. For example, while Wittig suggests that patriarchy functions in the novel as a system of oppression where men rule over women, I apply Wittig's theory of the social contract to suggest that the novel's interest in wildness and revolution is a product of heteropatriarchal ideals. Wildness or unlawfulness is produced by not being sufficiently white, male, or landed. Lawfulness ironically involves becoming masculine enough to abuse your spouse, animals, and children. Breaking the binary involves breaking certain lawful ideals, such as Hareton being okay with Kathy owning both houses, and Hareton trying to please his wife instead of abusing her. Thus, the ending means lawful systems must be broken to end the cycle, but this breaking is a restoration of order as the systems are rebuilt through rule changes. In her book, The Straight-Minded Other Essays, Monique Wittig argues there is a women's struggle where men dominate and own women, and that everyone in society is bound by the social contract that states they must behave a certain way and follow unspoken rules, otherwise they will be labeled as an outlaw and mad. Wittig discusses the power of the social contract when she says, precisely the rules and conventions, that which for them obviously makes life possible, exactly as one must have 2 legs and 2 arms, or one must breathe to live. The author is saying that these rules that people magically follow are necessary if one wants to live or function in society, and they have the same value as breathing. The social contract produces binary systems that are patriarchal and lawful, but they also produce the lawless or outlaw because of the people who do not fit into them. These systems can be used to see how Heathcliff was lawless by arriving as a foreigner with a different skin color who could not speak English, and so the lawful characters, like Mrs. Earnshaw, abused him. I argue that the social contract leads to Heathcliff's abuse because the unspoken laws command him to know how to speak English and to act. The lawlessness of Heathcliff is shown when Nellie says, "It" repeated over and over again some gibberish that nobody could understand. Mrs. Earnshaw was ready to fling it out of doors. The repetition of the word "it" shows how they have dehumanized Heathcliff by referring to him as an object. They call the language he speaks gibberish because it is not English and therefore defies the social contract. Heathcliff is dehumanized because his race and behavior do not align with the unspoken rules everyone must follow. While Wittig does not outright speak of racialization, the social norms that are entailed in the social contract would racialize someone who is considered an outlaw for being different. Therefore, when Wittig's ideas are applied to the novel, we can see the construction of the lawless character that is mistreated for not fitting with society, and as a result, will go on to mistreat others. Through Wittig's theory, reader can see it illustrate how it is not until Heathcliff leaves and returns, embracing his patriarchal authority, that he becomes a lawful character who abuses others, his wife, and animals. For example, Heathcliff's abuse of Linton is shown when he says to Cathy, and if you did meet my father, don't lead him to suppose that I've been extremely silent and stupid. Don't look sad and downcast as you were doing. He'll be angry. I suggest this shows that Linton is only spending time with Cathy out of fear of his father. In the following passage, Linton shudders at the thought of his father's anger, and that combined with the speech shows their abusive father-son relationship. Consequently, the binary is driving the cycle because Heathcliff was abused, and now he abuses his son to the point that Linton becomes an abuser himself. Heathcliff demonstrates the binary victim and abuser because he was a victim, and he causes the patterns of abuse to recur by teaching Linton that men own women and animals. Heathcliff traps Cathy and forces her to marry Linton so he will have control over her. I claim Heathcliff has influenced Linton into being a lawful abuser who needs to own his wife when Linton tells Nellie, "It's mine. Papa says everything she has is mine." Linton's ownership of Cathy's belongings is shown through the repetition of the word mine. However, when she offers her locket that contains pictures of her family in exchange for her freedom, Linton claims he already owns it, and this symbolizes him owning her memories, her relationships, and thereby herself. Then Nellie asks if Linton was pleased to see her hurt by Heathcliff, and Linton replies, "I winked. I winked to see my father strike a dog or a horse. He does it so hard, yet I was glad." Linton is glad he got revenge on Cathy for her pushing him, and that shows how Heathcliff has influenced Linton into entering the role of abuser. Heathcliff has taught Linton that abuse is part of the social contract. There's also the notion of Cathy being compared to a dog or a horse, a pet that Linton owns, and if it steps out of line, it needs to be punished. But it would say men hardly need to talk about what they own. The binary of victim and abuser produces the cycle of abuse because Heathcliff is abused by Hindley, then Heathcliff abuses his son Linton, and because of that, Linton becomes an abuser himself. Wittig's theory can be applied to show characters who are lawless are victimized, and those who are lawful use that power to abuse others. The cycle ends because Heathcliff loosens his hold on his patriarchal authority, while Hareton and Cathy figure out what it means to be in a lawless relationship where the man and the women are equals. Thank you.
So excellent work, very interesting, gender norms, outlaws, performances of all sorts of all kinds, and quite a bit of free indirect style, as it turns out. So I'd be happy to open the floor to questions for our panel.
My question is for Maddie.
Yeah.
Because I'm so intrigued by the title of your presentation. Would you be then, I guess, arguing, for lack of a better word, that Heathcliff doesn't become a man until he becomes an abuser? Like that's where the binary starts in all senses?
Not necessarily. I would argue that the binary starts in the beginning because the binary starts with him being abused by his brother. But I would say he doesn't become an abuser until he becomes a patriarchal man, a lawful man.
We're seeing a lot of like adherence to and breaking of gender norms and like the punishment of breaking gender norms. But and this is for anyone. So in some of these instances, we see characters are making it through because they're sticking to gender norms, and in other cases, they are kind of celebrated for breaking these gender norms, such as with the novels being women's work, but he's the one who ends up with her, and like Jane Eyre surviving, being the one who like accepts her differences, but she also conforms to a degree. So I was wondering like what we think marks the difference between breaking gender norms and being punished for it, and breaking gender norms norms and being punished for it, or being celebrated for it.
I mean, I could, well, like, in my larger paper, I go into, like, more Catherine and stuff. This was more about Henry. But, like, the lesson Catherine learns throughout, like, Northanger Abbey, like, she's very, like, enraptured in, like, in being in a Gothic novel and stuff, and she, like, learns kind of, like, to toe the line with that, so, like, she kind of, yeah. Sorry. Yeah, so it's kind of like learning, like, to toe the line between, like, gender, like going away from gender and, like, sticking with it.
This is for Natalie. So I know during your poster presentation, you kind of talked about how the movie version of Wuthering Heights is coming out.
Yeah.
Replace Heathcliff with a white man, while race is a big part of the novel. And I know you talk about lawlessness and how a part of his lawlessness is the fact that he is a person of color. So in what ways do you think that that would change the cycle of abuse that you talk about within your thesis?
That's a really good question. I think majorly, since that kicks off the binary, where it's abuser, victim, on and on and on. If you, like, the whole reason he is abused is because of his race, and then they hate him at first because he doesn't speak English. So that's huge. But I also think it like 50-50 could have gone either way, because they also hate him because Hindley, specifically his foster brother, hates him because his father favors him more than his own son. But that's not because their dad doesn't favor him because he's of a different race. He favors him because he's an orphan and he's trying to overcompensate for things. So I think Hindley still would have bullied him and abused him. And then Heathcliff kind of goes on to become an abuser because he wants revenge after the love of his life, Catherine, marries someone else. So he still would have gone on his plot for revenge. So I still think it's major to the story, but it still could have gone on and happened.
One thing, thanks panelists, great work. One thing I'm thinking about with all of your papers, like a through line with all of them is shame, but I'm not gonna ask about that, that's just like bracket it. But then also I was thinking about reading. So like Emma Bovary reads novels, right? Like that's part of her problem. That's part of her like pathology. And the way you're arranged, it's sort of like reading gets better, right? Like it's sort of like Sam, like reading like makes you fun is one of the morals of Northanger Abbey, I would say, like as well as expanding gender possibilities. And then in Jane Eyre, like her sense of self, I would say, like, well, I guess I have a kind of a question about that. Like, how do you think reading is involved in that sense of self that you see her having in contrast to some of her counterparts? Or like, if I asked, like, do you think reading helps her stand up to Rochester? I wonder how you could answer. But then before we, like, so think about it. And then, and then in Natalie, like the last scenes, like those flirty scenes with Catherine and Hareton, they're reading together, right? Like she's teaching him how to read. And we're meant to have this sense of like, oh, I see the future of these two, like flirtatious reading lessons. So I guess one question I have is definitely for Timby about like reading in Jane. Does that seem like it's a dangerous thing for her or a positive thing for her?
Yes and no. I mean, you have it early on where she is getting interviewed for the like boarding school that she goes to, and Mr. Brocklehurst is like, what are your favorite books in the Bible? And she is called, again, the quote is, you were an agent of the evil one, because her favorite book was not Psalms. So you have like negative experiences, but then she also learns to grow with it, and her like she herself becomes an author and writes her own story and like starts developing like a sense of self. Like she's literally telling her own story and in parentheses writing like her own side comments of, now I wouldn't do this now, but here's what happened then, and I'm not going to stray away from the truth. So it's a bit of yes and no, like very bad for like how others others looking in on her, but for her looking in on herself, it's very strengthening, I would say, and it helps her better understand herself and her emotions and her thoughts.
Nice. I mean, I have 1,000 follow-up questions, but other people can go. But I guess, can I just ask Sydney one question first? Is like, do you think that Emma's reading habits are part of that like elaborate irony that you described, in how like we're meant to view her through this lens where we're also like judging ourselves, judging her? I wonder, yeah, what do you?
I would say yes, because a lot of the novels that are depicted are very like cliche. It's all about like the romance, getting swept off your feet. There's a quote that says, Emma believes that love should come suddenly like lightning. So I think her reading all these traditional cliche novels are part of the irony, and I also think the education that she got is also part of it, since reading was a main thing that she had to do there, because there was really nothing else for her to do.
Thank you. Thanks.
Questions? Please.
My question is for Sam. I think the question, if the idea of novels being more of a womanly, feminine type of activity, could you argue or say that theoretically is it more of like a time period specific gender norm? Or could it have continued to more contemporary times like today, where women and people of the feminine like gender construct are usually just reading novels, and that's usually the feminine activity?
I think it like definitely has come to the modern day. Like it's definitely different, but like you always see like, you know, women are like shamed for reading like romance novels or whatever like all the time, and that's like seen as like a shameful activity still. So it's definitely continued into the modern day. It's a little different, like, because Catherine's reading like she is reading Gothic novels, and like the movie of Northanger Abbey like shows her with like these Gothic like figures and like falling in love with them, and like you could see like a modern day woman getting made fun of for that too, like reading just a romance novel.
I had kind of a follow-up question to the like punishment versus celebration question before, which I liked a lot. And I'm just going to say, I have not, unlike Professor Kiesel, I have not read any of these. Not, despite being a French professor, I have not read Madame Bovary. But there seems to be a lot of punishment in some way, of like conforming a lot and then kind of suffering for that, or not conforming and suffering for that. And I'm wondering, in terms of the role of punishment, like in what you think the novels are offering, is punishment kind of like a conservative thing, like get in line, like a warning, you know, or is it serving another purpose? Is it serving a purpose to like look at something different, look at gender performativity or gender norms differently, or?
In my larger thesis, I actually am arguing that Flaubert has wrote Emma as a cultural wording, something like, this is what happens when you read too many novels, so you should like limit your reading. But yeah, I think it's more of a just to like watch, like keep watching what you're doing.
It's like a conservative, okay, warning.
Well, so panelists, thanks very much for this really great kickoff to the whole event. Please join me in congratulating them one more time. Try to figure out something.
With the audio.
We're going to take 5 minutes to try and figure out our live stream. So get a cookie, and then we will continue again in 5 minutes, Fred.
I don't have cigars, but I have my wine.
I'll go.
Yeah, they make
I didn't read that criticism, but that's what I assumed was
She has
So have you read East Wind?
We have today one more panel, and let me also again remind you to tune in on differently, but in the same room and at the same time, 6 p.m. Tomorrow for more exciting adventures in literature, where we can learn whether or not we should be punished for reading it. That subject actually is already been covered. There are different subjects for tomorrow's program. So I'll invite you now to please welcome to the stage to introduce other people whom she will then ask you to invite to the stage. Welcome to the stage. Our very own Professor Allison Thesis.
Thank you so much for being here tonight. I'd love to invite the second panel down. Take care, please. Including in color. Yes. All right. Welcome, panelists. This panel's title is Identity in the Face of Interpolation, as represented in 19th century Americans. First paper will be presented by Tessa Beatty. The paper's titled Womanhood in East Lynne, Transmitting the Unconventional. Next we'll hear from Grace Lynn, The Superlative Degree of Comparison Only, Life, Death, and Identity Within a Tale of Two Cities. Isaac Silverson will present Frederick Douglass and his rhetoric towards his white male audience. And finally, Savannah Cooks will present Freedom in Captivity, the Black Woman's Search for Citizenship Through White Patriarchal Law in Kinhood. Please welcome our final panel of the night.
Women in the 19th century performed womanhood as established by the patriarchy. Failure to perform this established identity was an unsensible and poisonous concept. Yet East Lynne by Ellen Wood portrays the lives of women who do just that. These female characters, Isabel Bain, Barbara Hare, Affie Hallijohn, and, as discussed in this paper, Miss Courtney, struggle to maintain or maneuver through the status of patriarchally defined ideal womanhood, exemplifying the multiple outcomes for women in the 19th century who weren't quite women. These unwomen were considered unconventional, a term that identifies an individual's non-heteronormative performances of identity, behavior, and roles, such as womanhood. Ellen Wood's written expression of unconventional women through the exciting new sensational genre exemplifies the use of transmission, used here to define how women's gender roles and expectations are shared and enforced, both from non-familial women and media, what I call lateral transmission, and within the parent-to-child structure, what I call hereditary transmission. In my larger thesis, I argue that womanhood was defined in the 19th century as represented in East Lynne through one's roles as wife and mother. I suggest this definition stems from industrialization and the growing need for stability in an excessively inventive environment. I further argue that within the novel, unconventional women, in other words, women who fail to or refuse to become traditional wives and mothers as defined by the patriarchy, relied on hereditary and lateral transmission to understand and perform ideal womanhood or adopt adjacently womanly identities. Adjacent identities that I claim act as substitutes for heteronormative motherhood and wifehood are becoming a governess, acting as housekeeper or caretaker, committing to religious pursuits, and performing an adjacently motherly role. In this conference paper, I argue that industrialization, invention, and increased class mobility instigated the introduction of unconventionality and new roles for women. Then I claim that Miss Corny, one of the female characters in East Lynne, who does not identify as a patriarchally traditional wife or mother, is considered unconventional and must find an alternative way to become and remain a woman. The women in East Lynne have been analyzed by scholars such as Sally Mitchell, who claims that women struggle to be considered women, or even human, in the face of their sacrificial angelic identity. While Mitchell analyzes the lives and roles of women in East Lynne who struggle to become human in their conventionality, I find a lack of analysis on the unconventional woman as an unwomanly or inhuman struggle, and the role of lateral transmission in both a woman's knowledge of womanhood and the fear that arises when society is faced with a woman who breaks from the heteronormative structure. Secondary sources which aid my interventions of unconventional womanhood and transmission are Janet Oppenheim, claiming that the mother-daughter relationship informs women of the boundaries of a womanly identity, Via Solas, proving that through a case study that children mirror the behavior, actions, and lives of their parents, and Pamela K. Gilbert, claiming that the rise of germ theory in the 19th century impacted society's sphere of spreading social ideas. Because of this fear, society sought out stability wherever they could. One such enforced stability, as Jack Halberstone suggests in their essay, Female Masculinity, was gender identity, indicating that anyone who didn't conform to conventional gender identities, such as the unconventional women in East Lynne, were dangerous to society at large. Miss Corny, aka Cornelia Carlisle, is a spinster stepsister in her 40s who is perceived as unconventional in her willful masculine personality and single status. Miss Corny takes it upon herself to become her stepbrother, Archibald Carlisle's, mother figure when both of their mothers die. The reader discovers this motherly performance when the narrator first introduces Miss Corny. Quote, "The second Mrs. Carlisle died when her son Archibald was born, and his half-sister reared him, loved him, and ruled him. She bore for him all the authority of a mother. The boy had known no other, and when a little child he had called her Mamma Corny. Mamma Corny had done her duty by him, that was undoubted, but Mamma Corny had never relaxed her rule. With an iron hand she liked to rule him now, in great things as in small, just as she had done in the days of his babyhood." End quote. The focus within this initial introduction to Miss Corny on her role as mother emphasizes the importance of being a mother to her feminine identity. Phrases such as iron hand and never relaxing present Miss Corny in a critical tone. However, by saying she had done her duty, the duty of motherhood which makes up half of a woman's identity within East Lynne, the narrator declares Miss Corny a woman by replacing the idea of motherhood as a woman's duty with the statement that it was her duty. This switch in subject suggests that adopting adjacently womanly identities successfully saves unconventional female characters from being rejected as members of the category of woman. Miss Corny's status as mother and woman are also significantly indicated by the use of Mamma within the passage, by both Archibald and Miss Corny herself. Though her mothering of Archibald identifies her as a mother from social and personal perspectives, and thus sufficiently a woman, Miss Corny maintains her unconventionality within the motherly box by extending the roles and power of the mother. Particularly, this unconventional mothering appears in the author's emphasis on the authority Miss Corny held over her brother, as well as her ability to rule him. Motherhood during the Victorian era saw an increase of hired wet nurses and governesses. In fact, these roles became an expected addition to the household of middle-class or aristocratic families. As a result, nurses and governesses were able to become mothers without bearing their own children, ensuring their own womanly identities while removing previous care and educational responsibilities from biological mothers. While women, whether they be biological or vocational mothers, maintained the responsibilities of procreation, care, and education for their children, the figurehead of authority who held the ability to rule within the household was exclusively the father. Miss Corney takes on the roles of both mother and father, combining care and education with authority, sparking her masculine portrayal, which is subsequently described in other physical ways throughout the novel. The embodiment of such authority by Miss Corney may relate to her lack of motherly role model, or suggest a failure of masculinity in Mr. Carlyle. After all, Miss Corney treated him just as she had done in the days of his babyhood, placing his adult character as akin to that of a child's. Miss Corney's lack of motherly role model means she also lacks a source of hereditary transmission. Thus, for the majority of the novel, I argue that her knowledge of womanhood must come laterally from the women she experiences in social interaction and media exposure. However, the most significant contribution Miss Corney makes to the topic of transmission is the fact that her adjacently motherly role checks her unconventionality, much like medication can stop diseases from being contagious. Thus, the host remains affected, but does not spread illness or poisonous ideas to others. Because she has no children to hereditarily transmit unconventionality to, and because her motherly role translates her lateral transmission into patriarchal womanhood rather than unconventional womanhood, Miss Corney remains acceptably womanly and thus an accepted member of society. Miss Corney's continued portrayal as unconventional in characteristics and actions shows a repeated failure to adhere to the traditional patriarchal definition of the ideal woman. And yet her adoption of motherly duties enacted for her stepbrother successfully regains and maintains her identity as a woman. Where Miss Corney perseveres in maintaining a womanly identity, other female characters fail, resulting in their untimely death or unhappy life. A circumstantial outcome that relies on one's reception of womanhood transmissions and ability to transmit patriarchal womanhood in return. Thank you.
Charles Dickens' 1859 novel, A Tale of Two Cities, seems to be at its very core a story about dichotomies. Between France and England, rich and poor, cruelty and kindness. Each layer of the serialized novel appears at first to present one binary opposition or another that is acting as a core focus of the novel. However, the text is in fact constantly calling into question the validity of dichotomies, beginning at its very opening lines. The introductionary presentation of dichotomies lists the setting's opening time period, 1775, through the iconic lines, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." This is then followed by a series of opposites, each listed together: wisdom and foolishness, belief and incredulity, light and dark, hope and despair, everything and nothing, heaven and the other way. This huge expression of dichotomies is closed off with a claim that his solely superlative view of the era, listed out as an assured setting-defined claim, was mere insistent, common in the present day as well, by simply the noisiest authorities. While critics disagree on what this line means, I argue that it exists as not only the opening lines to the novel, but as the opening line to the novel's consistent preoccupation in coexisting dichotomies. Said preoccupation results in A Tale of Two Cities becoming imbued throughout with the core question of, can two supposed opposites exist simultaneously? In this paper, I take this interest that A Tale of Two Cities has in making opposites coexist and apply it to the binary between life and death. I choose life and death in the novel due to the prominence it holds in the text's consideration of dichotomies and its prevalence in the novel throughout. The first avenue to accomplishing the coexistence of these terms is through the fact that the text proposes incarceration as a form of life that is synonymous with death. I then show that the text considers freedom from incarceration as potential coexistence of life and death, but one it ultimately finds to fail as a complete solution, as it oscillates between the extremes rather than allowing them to exist together. I then examine A Tale of Two Cities' turn towards fame, which is sourced from the aforementioned incarceration death and is closer in line with the two together. I find fame to function as a coexistence only temporarily, with death threatening to supersede the life it provides. In my larger essay, this exploration of the relationship between life, death, incarceration, freedom, and fame that is presented here provides a foundation through which identity presents itself as a true way to lie life and death alongside one another. Within this conference paper, I interact with scholar Jan Elber's Darkness, Light, and Various Shades of Gray, The Prison and the Outside World, and Charles Dickens's A Tale of Two Cities, which analyzes the text's language and color theory to claim that the novel merges the free world with the realm of incarceration. I take Elber's argument on the merging of binaries, along with his points on the ways in which the prison system is equated with death, and build upon them to argue for the merging of the binary of life and death as a whole. The theory text that is most key to the framework through which I consider these concepts is Giorgio Agamben. Agamben analyzes the process through which the state or society determines which people are subject to the law and who can be exempted from it. This term homo sacer, meaning sacred man, refers to an individual who is considered acceptable to be killed within society, but not sacrificed. Agamben describes homo sacer as having entered into the intimate symbiosis with death, without, nonetheless, belonging to the world of the deceased. This is the state that imprisoned characters within A Tale of Two Cities occupy, a state where life and death can coexist. Beginning as early as Chapter 2, incarceration and death are equated together through multiple characters, but most notably through the lens of Dr. Manette and his relationship with the time of the Bastille. Mr. Laurie refers to Dr. Manette and his freedom from the Bastille refers to Dr. Manette's time as being buried alive for 18 years, and his freedom from the Bastille is commonly referred to by characters as being recalled to life, with prisoners later being called ghosts and released from prison being referred to as being burst from their tomb. The novel consistently utilizes knowledge that ties incarceration to death, connecting the two concepts so thoroughly that incarceration becomes a stand-in for death itself. Despite recalled to life being presented as synonymous with a release from captivity by other characters and Manette himself, freedom actually fails to return life fully to the death that is imprisonment. It instead results in a flipping between the two dichotomous extremes of incarceration death and a return to state before incarceration that acts as life. At various points of the novel, Dr. Manette is shown to occasionally lose where and when he is and be mentally sent back to his time at the Bastille due to the amount of trauma he experienced. During these times, he uses a shoemaking bench to create shoes, a craft he did not do before in prison. Jan Elber's text states that Dr. Manette's returns to his shoemaking group represents how Manette has internalized the prison and does not manage to overcome it. The formerly imprisoned doctor remains tied to its static world even after his release. Despite how his release from the Bastille is considered by the novel's characters to be a release from the death he's kept in, Dr. Manette nonetheless remains tied to this time. He becomes like Agamben's homo sacer, in a symbiosis with death, yet still alive. This non-dichotomous existence of life and death, wherein imprisonment acts as a form of death within life, has a non-dichotomous answer. Even when freedom appears to provide a full release from captivity, it instead results in a flipping between life and a metaphorical death. While freedom might provide an unstable oscillation between the realm of life and the realm of imprisonment and death, the text continues to subvert the life and death binary and potentially bring them to coexist by viewing fame as a potential source of life that can be sourced from the death of imprisonment. Dr. Manette is once again a helpful lens to view the novel's consideration and its complication of the binary of life and death through how he draws from his own imprisonment and subsequent freedom to save others. When the doctor discovers that his son-in-law Charles Darnay is in prison in the midst of the French Revolution in Book 3, he attempts to use the fame that his time in prison in the Bastille now grants him as a way to protect himself and Darnay. The revolutionaries have a very positive association with those who were wronged by the aristocrats, and Manette was treated especially cruelly by the aristocrats through his secret imprisonment. With the knowledge of this possibility of public favor, Dr. Manette tells Mr. Laurie that, quote, there is no patriot in Paris who, knowing him to have been a prisoner in the Bastille, would touch him. His old pain has given him a power. Manette attempts to use this power as a way to draw life from incarceration death. He believes he can use fame as a way to remove the death-like incarceration put upon his son-in-law and prevent Darnay's literal death. And this works, for a time. But when it does fail, more death follows. When the revolutionaries go to the prisons to kill the prisoners, Manette's presence is able to keep Charles Darnay from being killed. Using this fame, the doctor is able to bring Charles to trial and, along with bringing up Darnay's own past of having been tried for English treason, the two are able to use their collective renown to sway the revolutionaries' favor and have Darnay acquitted and freed. However, this power of Manette fails in the end, and he's unable to prevent the revolutionaries from sending Darnay to the guillotine after a second trial. Ultimately, it was stated that it was never known whether Dr. Manette actually tried to use his fame to sway the public against killing Darnay one last time, because the doctor's own non-literal death, his time at the Bastille, overwhelms him. His ties to his passing veneration reappear. He returns to climbing the stairs. He looks for the shoemaker's bench. His fame could not save Darnay nor himself from the respective deaths, and furthermore, it puts more people at risk of losing their lives once this fame shows its ineffectiveness. As Madame Defarge begins to plot with Jacques Reed, Wood Sawyer, and the Vengeance to implicate both the doctor and his daughter Lucy as conspirators against friends who should be executed, death seems to be exacerbated when fame's coexistence of life and death fails. The novel's consideration of fame as a subversion of the life and death binary points to it being a form of life that is able to be sourced from imprisonment, but is ultimately a temporary coexistence of the two concepts that eventually fails and brings about more death. From imprisonment existing as a shifting form of death within life, to freedom allowing life and death to be oscillated between, and finally to fame acting as a temporary form of life found within this imprisonment death, the dichotomy between life and death is already shaken by A Tale of Two Cities. But ultimately, it seems that none of these concepts truly place life and death alongside one another for long. This is where my full thesis posits that the themes of identity play their most crucial role within the novel. Identities as put upon individuals by those personally close to them and the public at large may at first appear to be synonymous with the fame that characters like Dr. Manette attempt to utilize to preserve the lives of others, but in actuality, it stretches beyond that. Identity's ability to provide a form of life and death that coexists together provides an answer to A Tale of Two Cities' preoccupation with simultaneously existing opposites, and furthermore speaks on the unfathomable water bespeckled with buried treasure that the novel posits is one person to any other. Thank you.
Frederick Douglass, a fugitive slave, was assured by his friend William Lloyd Garrison, tell your story, Frederick, as well as various other abolitionists urged him to speak on his experiences as a slave. But as he took to the stage, he cannot simply obey that request. He couldn't just narrate his wrongs that were inflicted upon him and his fellow slaves. He had to denounce it. Douglass wrote with each day of his freedom, as he says in my contract, freedom, I was growing and I needed room. However, this would not help him in his cause for abolition, and in fact become a detriment to question the validity of him being an escaped slave. His detractors would claim, he don't tell us where he came from, what his master's name was, how he got away, nor the story of his experience. Besides, he is educated and is in this a contradiction of all facts we have concerning the ignorance of slaves. This led to Douglass writing his different narratives where he knew he had to do much more than tell a story, but make use of rhetoric to sway and affirm his audience to the ways of abolition. Douglass's writing has been analyzed by an abundance of scholars, some analyzing Douglass's idea of freedom to be nuanced or understood. Some analyze the text under a lens of gender. As an example of an excerpt, Douglass' fight with the slave breaker Covey. Kwame Anthony Appiah brings insight that in order for Douglass to claim his freedom, he must not simply be a free person, but a free man. Angela Davis points out, however, that the statement within the definition of black freedom as the reclamation of black manhood is the obligatory suppression of black womanhood. Deborah McDowell's criticism of this theme is Douglass's refusal to be whipped represents not only as an assertion of manhood, the transcendence of slavery, an option his narrative denies to women. To McDowell's credit, she does not mean to diminish Douglas's work, but states these were views from the time in which Douglas lived. I argue that was not Douglas's aim, but rather he negotiated with white gender ideologies at the time and their impacts of intersectional forms of gender. Given Douglas's abolitionists, the North Star had a slogan, "Right is of no sex, truth is of no color." It's not hard to submit that Douglas by no means wanted to suppress black women in order for his claim to his freedom as a black man. More importantly, he was also very influential for his support during women's suffrage. It is important to remember that he was deeply influenced by the kindness of a select few of his masters, in particular, Sophia and Lucretia Auld. Douglas leads into his negotiations with the comparison of black feminine cruelty of Aunt Katie and the white feminine kindness of Lucretia Auld. Douglas has written on the typical attitudes of the aunts and uncles, that being a label for them and not an actual familial relation. Douglas juxtaposes the kindness of Lucretia with the cruelty of Aunt Katie, the fellow slave and chef of the slaves who would routinely starve him. After Douglas had gotten into an altercation with another slave child, a rock was thrown at him, leaving him with a deep gash of profusely bleeding. Aunt Katie rebukes Douglas, telling him he deserved it and leaving his wound untreated. Lucretia calls Douglas into the parlor and goes on to clean the wound, bandage, and treat it with balsam to help ease the pain. As Douglas writes, the balsam was more healing to the wound, or the balsam was not more healing to the wound in my head than her kindness was the healing to the wound of my spirit, made by the unfeeling words of Aunt Katie. After this, Douglas would come to regard Lucretia as a friend. She treated him with relative kindness, such as offering pieces of bread of Hungary, which was a powerful boon to the slaves. How it treats slaves were typically treated and starved on a plantation. These acts of kindness would keep Douglas from falling in despair as he reflects upon his life as a slave. I love to recall any instances of kindness, any sunbeams of humane treatment which found way to my soul through the iron grating of my house of bondage. Douglas also uses the performative Christianity, the difference of performative Christianity with his comparison of the public versus private treatment of slaves with Sophia. Sophia Auld to Miss Hamilton's treatment of Mary. Frederick Douglass had just been reassigned, moving from Colonel Lloyd's plantation to Hugh Auld's household to be a house slave. He meets the Auld family and is taken aback by Sophia Auld's initial treatment, whereas at Colonel Lloyd's plantation, Douglas had witnessed the horrors and inhumanity of chattel slavery. He juxtaposes Sophia's treatment of himself to the brutality of his neighbors, Miss Hamilton and Mary. Douglas uses the public and private Christian performances where Sophia treats Douglas with kindness of him being a little boy and even teaches him a bit of reading and as a good Christianly woman, while Miss Hamilton would beat and starve Mary, but later would go on singing her sweet hymn as though her righteous soul were sighing for the holy realms of paradise. In his narrative, he speaks of Sophia as if she was an angel. Douglas also delves into the attitudes of the Baltimore, discussing that most slave-holding people, even condemned and disliked Mrs. Hamilton and our treatment of Mary. This highlights the performative Christian gender nature of women and how slave-holding women would treat their slaves. Douglas now uses the notion of the corrupting nature of slavery to turn the previously good Sophia into someone that is cruel and vicious. Sophia Auld is caught teaching Douglas how to read and spell by her husband, who is told to stop being corrected on her behavior as a master. The mindset of slavery is not an intrinsic part of human nature, but something that had to be taught and reinforced. Mr. Auld had reassured her into had pressured her into becoming a demon that she she is later described as, that cheerful eye under the influence of slavery soon became red with rage, that voice that made all sweet accord changed to one harsh and horrid discord, and that angelic face gave place to that of a demon. Her Christian traits began to be destroyed as slavery's poison worked its way into her mind. Douglas describes how slavery can change a saint into a sinner and an angel into a demon. Douglas exposes how the slave master mindset corrupts Sophia Auld, and she began to no longer see Douglas as a child, but as a slave, and treat him as such. The mindset of slavery not only destroyed her motherly nature, but also her Christian morality as well. The disproportionate power of balance damages the slave and destroys not only the disproportionate balance of power damages the slave, but also destroys the master's mind and morality. Douglas tackles how he had to reclaim his free will by rising above a passive slave role and fighting back against Kobe, reclaiming his freedom through his manhood. Douglas is sent to a slave breaker to break his behavior that would be deemed inappropriate, specifically his ability to read and write. Kobe is seen as the epitome of the evils of slavery. He's cruel, malicious, and works to destroy Douglas's will, leading to say, behold a man transformed into a brute. This steady abuse steadily boiled over where Kobe attempted to put a rope around Douglas's ankles. Douglas fights back and assaults Kobe, and they get into an altercation. Despite Kobe calling for help, his farmhands would come and deny to aid him and left him alone to fight against Douglas. Kobe eventually breaks free and backs down from the fight, and afterward, leaving Douglas alone after that point. Douglas had conquered over Kobe and regained his willfulness. Douglas' sense of self is renewed as he says, I was a man now. He realizes that he cannot wait for his freedom and he must fight for it. This fight against Kobe not only represents a turning point for Douglas to rebel against slavery, but he also regains his manhood. This rhetoric works to engage the white audience who at the time would enjoy seeing the emasculation of a slave breaker and a slave become a man as he earns his freedom to continue and continues to fight for his freedom. Douglas exposes the fragility of slavery, how Kobe does not report Douglas to the authorities, where such an offense would have had him hanged, but Kobe had been invested by a young Douglas of 16 of age, who had ruined his image as a powerful slave breaker. Douglas's ability to negotiate with the intersection of slavery impacts the gender roles of both the slave and master, whereas the idea of a pious woman can become warped into a slave master, or how the reclamation of manhood is a path of freedom and rebellion. This is why I view Douglas's writing not as a subjection of black womanhood freedom, but rather as the use of normative gender roles at the times and how slavery impacts the forms of gender.
In Octavia Butler's time travel novel, Kindred, protagonist Dana Franklin says one vouching for herself and the abuse she faces from her white ancestor, Rufus White. She narrates, if he ever raped me, it was unlikely either of us would survive. However, how did Dana, a black woman determined to keep her, or to maintain her freedoms, get to the point of survival where her sexuality was the one thing for her. Set in 1976, Dana passes out while moving to her new apartment with her white husband, Kevin. It wakes up over a century prior to the 1800s. A predator informs for Dana. She'll be in the safety of her home in 1976 and be uncontrollably snatched into the 1800s. She soon learns that she's being sent back in time to save Rufus from dying to ensure he lives long enough to produce her ancestor. However, the conflict was that Dana was a free black woman placed in the middle of American slavery. Just being seen by the wrong person would put her in danger of being tortured. The longer she's in the 1800s, the more protection she needed to survive.
This pushes her to latch onto Rufus to keep her freedom in 1976 intact in the 1800s. My larger essay aims to explore Octavia Butler's approach to the connection between interracial heterosexual affection and literal obsession, where the novel suggests that both could be problematic roots of freedom. I argue that within kindred, freedom is inaccessible to black women unless it's through a white man. This gives a white man a power over a black woman, where the imbalance controls the relationship to the point that she becomes his possession. The first claim that I prove is that Dana's husband, Kevin, offered her protection in the 1800s. However, because he held no authority on the Wayland plantation, Dana still fell victim to the horrors of the time period. The next claim that I prove is that Rufus provides Dana with a more stable form of protection than Kevin could. However, as Rufus grows older, he becomes cruel and manipulative, not caring about how Dana feels, but rather what he wants. Lastly, I used a character named Alice and her suicide at the end of the novel as a bridge point to Dana claiming her own freedom from Rufus by murdering him. Within this conference paper, I claim that Dana's attempt to influence Rufus as a child to be anti-slavery ultimately fails as he grows older and threatens Dana's freedom. Many scholars have analyzed Kevin and Dana's interracial relationship within the novel, such as Guy Foster and Diana R. Poland, who focus on the cultural and political implications of their marriage on the both the past and the present. What existing scholarship lacks on the topic of interracial relationships within kindred is a frame on Dana and Rufus. Although the relationship was not romantic and only turned sexual when Rufus tried to rape Dana at the end of the novel, I analyze the relationship from an interracial point of view and conclude that the power imbalance in the relationship stems from the societal forces that places white people above black people. This seemingly justifies Rufus's cruel treatment of Dana, making her an object rather than human. The idea of black people being objects in the 1800s is the main part of my larger essay, from whose branches my first term possession. The way that I use this term is by someone owning something. For example, being owned by another person, owning an object, owning oneself, or even owning one's metaphorical being. Within the novel, we see white men buying black people, and through that, they legally possess that person. Other ideas of ownership can stem from marriage, as Kevin states that Dana belongs to him due to their union, and from a biological standpoint of owning one's children. Another key term that I use is Stephanie Smallwood's paradox of freedom in America. She claims that the paradox of the Western theory of freedom was produced for a white heterosexual male and dependent on the labor of, quote, wives, children, servants, and other dependents whose political subjectivity was subsumed under his patriarchal authority. In Smallwood's words, only through the oppression of people of color, women, and children is the white man's freedom made possible. This claim is relevant in kindred when Dana has her first real encounter with Rufus as a child. As he expresses the brutality he faces from his father, Dana narrates that Rufus shows her the crisscross of long red welts on his back. Rufus then goes on to say that the punishment was with a whip, quote, the kind his father whips N-words and curses with. As a child, Rufus holds no authority or freedom over his individual self, making him possessed by his father, the ultimate figure of the antebellum American society. This forms a commonality between Rufus and black people, thus prompting Rufus to sympathize and fear for them. This is evident in Rufus begging Dana to call him Mr. Rufus because he did not want her to get punished if his father hurt. Rufus says to Dana, you'll get in trouble if you don't, if Daddy hears you. The desperation seen in Rufus as he tries to protect Dana leads her to believe that Rufus's experience of being beaten and powerless at the hands of a white authority figure will give him a part of the knowledge of what it's like to be black, and in turn gives her the leeway to influence him. This is only possible while Rufus and Dana are on the same level of power, but I claim as he gets older, the imbalance between the two makes it impossible for Dana to mold him into what she imagines a white abolitionist to be. Another term this essay will examine is citizenship, framed through Lauren Barrett's idea in her essay, Queen of America Goes to Washington City. Within her essay, Barrett discusses the flawed idea of liberal citizenship, which claims that each human being is born with human rights that the law upholds to protect for legal citizens of a country. Those protections of those rights and the equal treatment within a country is what gives the individual citizenship. What Berlant claims is how black women who are sexually violated in the face of the law, quote, blurs the lines between the disembodied elements of liberal citizenship at the places where bodies experience the sensation of being dominated. By the law not protecting black women's citizenship, the liberal understanding is dismantled, meaning that these women metaphorically do not hold citizenship within the United States. Readers can see the lack of citizenship held by black women in kindred when Dana comes across the aftermath of Rufus trying to rape Alice. At the end of the previous chapter, we saw Dana attempting to build what she calls insurance with Rufus to ensure his protection in her later trips. In this next chapter, 5 years have passed, and she appears next to Rufus while Alice's husband meets him for the attempted rape. Dana narrates, maybe they had grown up to be even worse than what I imagined. The situation at hand shows just how little influence Dana has on Rufus when she last left him. While in the previous chapter, Rufus sympathized with black people, he now complains to Dana about them not submitting to his rule. Rufus says that Alice would rather, quote, have a buck and word than me. Dana sarcastically replies, how dare she choose her own husband? She must have thought she was a free woman or something. For context, Alice was born free. Considering her status from a framework of love relationship, she was entitled to rights, freedoms, and protections by the law. However, by Rufus trying to rape her, by her, take her away from her husband, that status was taken from her. Within the 5 years that Dana was gone, Rufus turned to the one thing she feared most: a white man abusing his power to profit off of black people, especially black women. While Dana shows concern for Alice being caught running away with her husband and sold into slavery, Rufus says it is her own fault. Rufus wanted to punish Alice for not wanting him, and knowing that they would never escape, he planned to buy Alice and separate the couple. Dana says, so you'll be rid of the man and have the possession of the woman just as you wanted. Great reward. Rufus claims that he begged Alice not to go with her husband. He gave Alice the ultimatum to be with him without any restrictive measures, but since she denied his advances, he took authority as a white man and turned her into one of his possessions. Although Dana criticizes Rufus for his actions, she still needs him to survive. In the aftermath of Rufus's attempted rape, Dana's motives to convince Alice and her husband to run away were not because she was she was for her safety. If Alice's husband killed Rufus, Dana would not have the protection she needed in the 1800s. She narrates, no matter what he was, I needed him alive. In order to survive in the antebellum South, Dana had to submit to the white patriarchal law, leading to her to disregard Rufus's actions in favor of her own self-preservation. The pair hold to understanding that they, quote, should never lie to each other. They both had too much opportunity for retaliation. But as Rufus grows older, he cares less about Dana saving him and more about having her as one of his possessions in her pursuit of power. Dana slowly submits to his authority despite the endless times that they both hold power over one another. An example of Dana giving it to Rufus is after he buys Alice and she refuses to let him sexually abuse her. In frustration, Rufus forces Dana to make Alice deliver herself to him, threatening to make Dana watch as the overwatcher, quote, beats some sense into Alice. Seeing the aggressive nature within Rufus and knowing the feeling of being whipped herself, Dana convinces Alice to let Rufus rape her in the justification that she was, quote, helping the girl help her avoid at least some pain. While I'm sure that protecting Alice from physical harm was a part of Dana's motivation, I argue that the scene serves as an act of self-preservation for herself, just as we saw when she convinced Alice and her husband to run away. At this point in the novel, Dana needed to please Rufus to ensure her own safety from becoming enslaved. The power that they once held over each other is gone because Rufus knew that Dana needed him to survive more than he needed her. Her one boundary of not being raped by him is nowhere to be seen in relation to Alice. She allows Alice to be put at a disadvantage so that she can survive the 1800s with her own freedom intact. Through the scene, Dana is now wholly one of Rufus's possessions, controlled by his will, and the only way to break free from his hold is by murdering him.
Thanks so much, panel. Incredible work. We'll open the floor to questions. Charlie?
This is for Grace. I have many questions, and I'm trying to narrow it down because I was really intrigued by your thesis. How do you compare the incarceration between Dr. Mamet and Charles Darnay, especially considering the way Charles Darnay's ends?
Yeah, in my full thesis, I do go into Charles Darnay's incarceration death, and I think in a lot of ways they're almost meant to mirror one another, and some of the referring to prisoners being ghosts, that is a common theme when Charles Darnay is in prison. The other prisoners are referred to as ghosts. So I kind of find that both Dr. Manette and Charles Darnay act as like a lens to the incarceration being death.
This is for Tessa. Let me try and phrase this in a way that makes sense. So you mentioned like adjacent roles of womanhood, like specifically with
like a governess role. And I feel like in a lot of literature of that time period, governess is like a very common trope. And I feel like that's, as far as I know, like not so much a thing anymore, at least for like middle class in America. Like I've never heard someone be like, oh yeah, my governess is coming over on Tuesday. Like I feel like that's not really a thing anymore. So
I have one.
oh, my bad. So what like kind of roles now do you think would be adjacent roles of women? Because like I can think of some ideas, but I want to know, like, do you think that that's still sort of a system in place, or is that sort of like going away as like the governance and that kind of role is going away?
Yeah, great question. I feel like, which there are educators in the room, so this could be a dangerous, but I feel like education is one of those roles, because I think you have kids in a sense, and you're taking care of them, you are educating them, you're there to like support them in moments of distress, and so I find that to be a very caretaker role that would be in the same lines of a governess who is taking care of them in like physical needs, but then also education, watching them on the day-to-day. Obviously that changes on the different levels of education, so like elementary, middle school, what have you. But yeah, I would say education for sure is one of the big ones. Jacob?
Just Savannah, would you argue that Dana's decision to kill Rufus at the end of the novel is more about self-preservation or about protecting others from being harmed by Rufus?
I feel like it's more about self-preservation, just because throughout the novel we do see Rufus harming multiple characters. Like there's a part of the novel where Rufus has an interaction with somebody who's enslaved, a man that's enslaved on the Wayland plantation, and Rufus gets jealous essentially, and he ends up selling him because of that. But although Dana kind of criticizes him for it, she doesn't. That's the most that she does. But then at the end of the novel, the only time she actually thinks about killing Rufus is from the fact that he's about to break her. So I feel like it's more self-preservation rather than protecting other people.
My question is for Savannah, because our theses are very similar in terms of like genre. And my question would be, what role do you think solidarity plays between Dana and Alice in their stories and how they end up at the end of the novel, if it plays a role at all?
What do you mean by solidarity?
Like female empowerment, or like sticking by each other, kind of like the us, like maybe like women against men mentality. Yeah, do you think that plays a role?
I don't think it does, because Dana and Alice are kind of at odds, where Alice she's very, I don't want to say mean towards Dana, but she insults Dana a lot, and I feel like it's because of the fact that the roles are pretty similar when it comes to Rufus, where Dana is attached to Rufus and she gets those privileges through him, and then the same thing is with Alice, where she's attached to Rufus and gets the privileges through him. But Dana is more, she chooses to be attached to Rufus, while Alice is more, she's forced to do it. And so Alice kind of has that like resentment towards Dana for that. And so they're not like, they're not together like empowered wise, but they're more at odds. And Alice often relates Dana to being white, and so there's a contrast there, and that's kind of like a battle between the two.
My question is also for Savannah. What responsibility, if any, do you think Dana has towards like protecting the other people on the Wayland plantation, like specifically the other enslaved people, but anyone? And kind of like as a follow-up to that, like I think you seem to argue like in your thesis that she does kind of more towards the self-preservation side, but like if she didn't, like what power do you think she would have, if any,
to minimize the harm that Rufus is doing?
I feel like she kind of would a little bit, but not really. As I said, like about the part where Rufus sold the man that was enslaved after the plantation, he continued to sell slaves after that. So it wasn't like, even though she told him that not to, he still did. But then also in the beginning of the novel, she, this is something I go into in my thesis, she informs him that it's insensitive to call people the N-word. And then like a chapter later, after a 5-year time jump, he continues to call people the N-word just because Dana isn't there to influence him his whole life. She's only there for like a few months, and then he goes years without seeing or hearing from her. So she's not there to like continuously teach him the ways of not being racist. And so I feel like Dana really doesn't have an impact on protecting other people on the plantation.
So, panelists, thanks all of you very much for interesting things. And it's kind of interesting to see how some of these go together in some really cool ways. And so I think obviously, Isaac and Savannah, your papers are kind of connecting up as kind of depictions of slavery, and that with some sort of rhetorical component to it. So Isaac, so I wonder if you could start us by talking a little bit about what I think it seems like is a part of Douglas's rhetoric toward his white audience, right? And which is fundamentally about the corrupting power of slavery, right? So that ultimately there's really no such thing as a person who is a good slave owner, even if somebody is well intentioned at first, that they all sort of make their way. They start by teaching by teaching the slaves, and then they end up they go this way. And so in terms of that kind of audience. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, and then maybe Savannah, you could that's very clearly a part of, for instance, so what's Dana's husband's name? Kevin, yeah. So Kevin getting stuck there for a bunch of time and all that's going on. But so Isaac, I'd love to hear what you have to say.
So that part is definitely like, I really delved in on with the Sophia Olive portion,
yep,
where she is initially not very well, like she is initially very sweet to him, like teaches him read and write and like basic things, like even if it's enough just to like read the Bible. But then after he all kind of reinforces and presses down the idea of what a good slave master should do, because what he would teach or say to her is that an educated slave is bad because he will learn that he is enslaved, and then therefore he will be miserable. So it's kind of like a twisted way of subjecting people by just keeping them dull and dumb while basically just keeping power over them. Douglas even really gets really into educational stuff. Like he very much sees education and literature as being like a big gateway to freedom. And later on, as he like kind of gets more educated, this helps him like kind of earn his freedom, because he's able to like get a skilled labor job later on in his life, which kind of helps afford him his ability to like survive off of like plantation and actually be like able to live a life in the North and later Canada. So
yeah, so this is great. It seems like it's important for Douglas that he, rather than being taught how to do this, he barters for it with the children, right? That seems to be the more more constructive form of education that he has.
Yeah, he definitely had to figure out ways of getting educated, like you mentioned, where he would like borrow some of the other people, like little pieces of food to get taught by some kids how to read a thing or two. And even some of his dialogue, he met with other white people who saw slavery as a very bad thing and kind of pitied him for it. So I'm trying to think back. What was the main question again?
No, it sounds great. I think you've really gotten at it. So Savannah, so is Kevin done for because he's had 5 years of whiteness in the South at that time?
I don't think he's done for. I think one of the things that Octavia Butler is kind of a main aim of her, well, not main aim, but one of her aims of the novel is that she's kind of discussing how although slavery ended like a century, I want to say ago, in 1976, because there's still the effects of slavery in today's society, and so white men still have power over black women, and then you can kind of see that within the struggles within Dana and Kevin's relationship, because he's often like aggressive with her, he wants her to do what he wants her to do, and when they go back to the 1800s, Dana often questions, she often compares him to Tom Whalen, which is Rufus's dad, and so, which is really strange because she holds out hope that Rufus won't be influenced by society, but with Kevin, she kind of fears that Kevin will be influenced by the 1800s, and then after he gets stuck in the 1800s for 5 years, and when she sees him again, she kind of talks about the changes, about his accent changed and how he's more aggressive than he was before, but I think that it's more of a battle for Kevin, because although he is put in a position of power in the 1800s, without Dana there, he still became an abolitionist, and he would help slaves get to the north. And so I don't think he's done for. I think he knows that it's wrong, but he still has the effects of the 1800s on him.
Great, thank you.
Yep, sorry. My question is for Grace. With this idea of death being somewhat synonymous with incarceration in A Tale of Two Cities, could it kind of correlate to that same time period in the non-fictional realm, and could it also somewhat correlate to contemporary times and how incarceration is kind of seen now?
That's a good question. I think that, in terms of, criticism towards incarceration and, the effects it can have, I think it's definitely a theme that can be seen all over. I think that Charles Dickens, when writing about incarceration, he personally had experiences with his father being in jail, and so he has very much to say about the problems with it. And so I think that in terms of commentary towards the harmful effects and the lasting effects it has on Dr. Manette, is definitely something that can be seen throughout history, including today.
All right, thank you very much, everyone.
For adventures in the 20th century.
Yeah.